Every month, we have a segment on our podcast called Game of the Month, where we bring a game to the forefront and give you our thoughts on the game, giving away a copy of that game, and also wrapping it up with this video. So, with Alan Wake 2 right around the corner, we here at Bucket Bytes thought now was the best time to—
Hey! That's my line! What, are you stealing my thing now?
I'm sorry, Josh, but your intros are just too good.
Alright, man, sure, whatever, go ahead.
I want to advise that this video will remain mostly spoiler-free, as to not dive too much into the story outside of the beginning and some of the themes of the game. This is not a summary of the story, but rather a bite-sized look at what the game is and my experience with it. There will not be any kind of numerical scores at the end of the video, nor will there be a recommendation as to whether or not you should play it. Now that's for you to decide. Alan Wake is a psychological action-adventure thriller developed by Remedy Entertainment that was originally released on the Xbox 360 back in May of 2010. Now this is a release that went hugely under the radar for most gamers because, well, if you remember, this was also the same day that another huge game was released. What game was that? None other than Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption. That was a great year for game releases, by the way. Not only did you have Red Dead Redemption, but you also had Mass Effect 2, God of War 3, Halo Reach, just to name a few. This obviously would have caused some initially low sales figures, but the game did start getting momentum and sold more than 2 million copies by 2012. The game definitely grew a cult following and, admittedly, I'm one of those followers. Since we are looking back at Alan Wake using the remastered version of the game, there are a few small differences where nearly all of the product placement from the original game is now gone, but it did retain all of the original licensed music. The remastered version is just that, remastered. It's not a completely rebuilt version of the game, similar to like what we've seen from Resident Evil and other games recently. In this part of the video, we will cover a very early portion of the story that I really wouldn't consider spoilers to the game. It's just enough information to give you an idea of what the plot is. Written by Sam Lake, who was also the creative director and writer for games like Max Payne, Control, and Quantum Break, the story of Alan Wake had received the 2011 Best Story Award at the BAFTA Awards and is generally critically acclaimed. Now, the game features a best-selling crime fiction author who is struggling from writer's block. His name? Well, it's in the title. It's Alan Wake. His wife Alice and him head to the small mountain town of Bright Falls, Washington for a vacation. Now, this is done at the request of his eccentric agent, Barry. When they arrive in town, they go to the local diner to get the keys to a cabin on a lake from a man called Carl Stuckey, but instead, a mysterious old woman tells him that Stuckey had fallen ill and that she was the one who was to give Alan the keys. She directs them to the cabin that's in the middle of Cauldron Lake, where Alan experiences a vision of the old woman. While they are unpacking, Alice reveals that the purpose of their trip is actually for Alan to overcome his writer's block by speaking with a local psychologist. Now, Wake is obviously upset at the deception and storms out, only to hurry back when he hears Alice's cry for help. When he finds Alice, she is suddenly dragged into the lake by some mysterious force, and Alan dives after, blacking out after he gets in the water. Alan wakes. Do you get it? Alan Wake, he wakes. Anyways, Alan wakes as if he had driven his car off the road with no prior memory as to how or why he was there. He makes his way to a gas station where he encounters shadow-like creatures that he combats with light and a flashlight. Along the way, Alan deals with a figure in a diving suit repeatedly who leaves behind pages of a manuscript titled Departure, which was clearly written by Alan, but he had no memory of writing it. Soon, he realizes what's been written on the manuscript pages are actually coming true, and it's from here that Alan continues his journey to find answers as to what actually happened. Now, there's no question that the game had many influences and clearly alludes to them in the game. Author Stephen King was a huge inspiration for the main character. In an interview back in 2005 before the game's release, writer Sam Lake mentioned that Stephen King is clearly one source of inspiration. Clearly. An author that's plagued with nightmares and visions, suffering from writer's block, whose wife is probably dead, is exactly what the 1998 novel Bag of Bones is about. However, in that interview, Sam also mentioned that he's actually never even read that book before. You can also see an homage to The Shining, where an axe goes through a door during a sequence when trying to evade a taken enemy in a logging yard.
Here's Johnny.
Alan Wake uses an episodic format, making it feel like you're watching a TV series, something that Remedy has done in other games, like Quantum Break. This breaks up the story in a way where the story can actually be absorbed fairly easily. Often, it's a great time to put the game down and come back again later, as the start of the next episode has a recap as to everything that had just happened in the previous episode. And it was perfect. Let me tell you, it was perfect for my ADHD mind. Now, if you weren't aware, Alan Wake is part of the Remedy connected universe, which means that other games like Control also exist within this universe. In the remastered version of the game, there's at least one new Easter egg when visiting the sheriff, where a letter was sent from the Federal Bureau of Control by William Kirkland, who was the Bureau's head of investigations prior to his 2019 resignation. Further details are perhaps for another video, but the connected universe and Remedy's willingness to connect the games continues to intrigue me. And that game, if I didn't mention, was Control. Composed by Petri Alanko, the soundtrack also features the work of Finnish rock band Poets of the Fall, who are known in-game as the band The Old Guards of Asgard. Two of the band members are actually seen in the game. Poets of the Fall also wrote 2 original songs for the game. There were other licensed songs in the game that had actually expired, but were renewed again in the 2018 remastering. The sound design for the game is solid. Running through the forests is eerie, and the ambient sounds and music do well to complement the visuals of the game. Additionally, voice acting is stellar, as Matthew Peretta, who voices Alan Wake, delivers a fantastic performance as the struggling writer. The rest of the supporting cast does a fantastic job creating believable characters throughout the narrative of the game. My only pain point with the audio in Alan Wake is the sound design of how enemies talk.
Pleased to meet you. Non-refundable reservation deposit required. Fair.
It just seems low effort and a little corny in how the voices are distorted. But I can appreciate that extra bit of effort to make you feel uneasy as the player. Originally created using the Havoc physics engine, the remastered version of the game opted to remain on the same engine, just upgrading the resolution and lighting, rather than changing to the newer Northlight engine that was used for Control. It's a nice refresh for the 2010 game, and, to be honest, the original game still kinda holds up today. The atmosphere is consistent in setting the tone for the game. Lighting effects are great, and there are a lot of props within the game to help you feel embedded in the universe. Even though the game is remastered with higher resolutions, you are reminded that Alan Wake released in 2010. The character models, while not awful, just lack a lot of what most newer games are able to show to make them feel alive. Though, I guess not all games these days do a great job of not making characters look like they don't have a soul. Alan Wake is a third-person action-adventure, so you spend most of your time in-game looking over the shoulder of the protagonist. You are able to toggle which shoulder you're able to look for, which should be a standard inclusion in a game like this. Almost all of the game's mechanics are introduced to you immediately during a dream sequence and are done in a way that pulls you into the premise of the game. You get a taste of the enemies and how to counter or eliminate them with simple instruction, before you're let into the story to figure things out on your own. Why can't all game tutorials be like this? During the game, in addition to the story quest, there are pages of a manuscript which can be used to give more insight as to what's about to happen, or maybe what already did happen. More of this is explained within the story, but it's a great collectible run for you to obtain all of the pages. It's also a nice added touch that only a few of them are locked in the Nightmare difficulty mode, so if you want to read the whole story, you can do it while getting absolutely battered by enemies of darkness and their sickles. Additionally, there are 100 coffee thermoses in the game for you to collect, though you don't receive much of a benefit other than a toxic amount of caffeine running through your veins and a sweet Chivo. Golly, does anyone else remember when getting achievements, by the way, was something people actively tried to do? What happened to that magic? Anyways, there are secret locations that are highlighted when you hover your flashlight beam over them, usually highlighted with arrows or dots, where you'll typically be rewarded with some flares, ammo, batteries, stuff to help you not be so scared of the dark. This encourages exploration of the stages as you navigate your way through the story, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Oftentimes, you can find yourself needlessly meandering through the woods and getting lost or turned around. Luckily, there's a mini-map of sorts, but not quite what you might expect. It's not your traditional mini-map where you can see paths in the environment, but rather just an indication of where your next objective is. I actually like this, as you're meant to find your way through the environment you've never been through. That adds quite a bit to the tension. I'll take the blame here for kind of being an idiot and getting lost in the forest, which I did a lot. Gunplay is fun, and switching to different weapon types is easy, though I wish when you picked up a new weapon it didn't automatically switch to it for you. So many flares were wasted accidentally. I love how Remedy used light as a weapon to take down the taken enemies, and I was further impressed with the increasing difficulty by adding newer and different types of enemies throughout the game. There were parts of the game where you didn't have a gun to finish off some of the enemies, so you really had to think outside the box a bit, and I absolutely loved it. There are segments within the game where you are tasked with driving a vehicle in some larger areas. Now, this can best be described as clunky. The physics of watching the cars bounce up and down while you're driving as if you were making love in the back seat is kind of fun to watch. And the control of the vehicles it's alright. But driving felt unfinished. If you were able to go off-roading or just generally exploring, you'd find yourself smashing into what felt like invisible walls on small inclines and only induced a small amount of rage in me. Only a little. Thankfully, there wasn't much driving in the game. It could have been, however, because they actually wanted to make this game an open world game originally, so we can count our lucky stars it wasn't. That also could be a completely different story, but the story is very linear with typically smaller areas to play in. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the Night Springs episodes that could be found on some of the TVs throughout the game. Akin to the Twilight Zone, these little episodes break up the gameplay in times to allow you to catch your breath perhaps after a long section of intense combat. Night Springs is a fictional show about the paranormal and typically run about 3 to 4 minutes. While I didn't love all of them, episodes like the very first one you find, called Quantum Suicide, are very entertaining and worth watching. Now, note that none of these actually have anything to do with the game or the story really at all, and aren't necessary to understanding the story of Alan Wake. Critically, Alan Wake was received mostly well, receiving mostly high scores from major publishers and gamers alike. It's a perfect mix of excellent story and unique gameplay elements that gave us the cult classic we know today. Playing it again all of these years later, I can say without putting on those rose-colored glasses that Alan Wake holds up on its own as a narrative action thriller. That doesn't mean it doesn't have its faults, with the clunky driving mechanics and the pretty terrible platforming. Wait, have I not gone into the platforming? My God, I haven't. Welcome to the new segment. Alan Wake features third-person action gameplay that includes some elements of platforming. While you have full control of the camera, jumping from platforms can be extremely frustrating, especially because the game doesn't feature any kind of clambering mechanic, or at least one that doesn't work consistently. If you happen to undershoot or overshoot your target, there's no way for you to fix it by grabbing on. That can cause some frustrating pain points, and I hope to God this is something that is fixed in Alan Wake 2. Anywho, continuing on my closing statements. With a variety of collectibles to keep you exploring, to a variety of different enemies and different ways to dispose of said enemies, Alan Wake is a fun action thriller that I hope you give a try at some point. But if you don't and want to get into Alan Wake 2 right away, without playing the original, make sure you go check out a complete story summary of the game so you're caught up. The best one can actually be found at Suggestive Gaming's YouTube page, which is linked in the description, where he goes full in depth of Alan Wake, all of the DLCs, media, and actually even Control. The link to that video is linked in the description below. There's nothing you won't know going into Alan Wake 2. So if you guys liked this video, please let me know in the comments. There's a whole video alone that could be made on the development of Alan Wake. So if that's something you think you'd like to see, please let me know in the comments as well. And be sure to check out our podcast, Bucket Bytes, where we talk gaming and a lot more, as well as having various guests, including, but not limited to, Hollywood producers, pop stars, artists, authors, game developers, rappers, but we've had so much more. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.